Good evening and welcome. I'm Debra Schmidt Bach, Curator of Decorative Arts at the New York Historical Society. Before we begin tonight's discussion, I would like to thank our trustees, our Chairman's Council, and all of our members and other generous donors. Your support allows New York Historical to continue to pursue our mission to make history matter. The New York Historical Society is currently open on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, so reserve your time entry tickets on our website. I would also like to extend a special thanks to my colleagues working behind the scenes tonight, particularly Oscar Acevedo, who is assisting us in running the slides. Before we launch into our program, I want to let you know that this will last approximately 45 minutes, including 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end. You can submit your questions through the Q&A function on your Zoom screen at any point during the presentation. We have disabled the chat function, so please do make sure to use the Q&A after the presentation, and we will get to as many questions as time allows. So Oscar, if you could advance to the next slide, thank you. Many Americans associate the name of Tiffany & Company with larger-than-life tournament trophies, sumptuous jewelry, and the firm's iconic turquoise boxes. But fewer people are aware of the firm's fascinating 183-year history as a groundbreaking New York City retailer, let alone how it became synonymous with exceptional American silver. In the next 45 minutes, we'll take a brief tour of some of the highlights from New York Historical Society's incomparable Tiffany silver collection. To begin, Charles Louis Tiffany was the founder of the firm that would become Tiffany & Company, and it was founded in 1837. Tiffany was born in Killingly, Connecticut in 1812, and he was the son of a textile manufacturer named Comfort Tiffany. Comfort Tiffany ran a successful small cotton mill in the area, as well as a large supply store. In 1828, Comfort Tiffany installed his 15-year-old son, Charles, as the head of the supply store. And it is probably there where Charles Tiffany trained as a merchant. In 1837, Charles Tiffany and a schoolmate, John B. Young, relocated to New York City. They arrived in New York City armed with an investment of $100,000 that was supplied by Charles's father, and opened a fancy goods store, the store that you're seeing illustrated in this slide, at 259 Broadway and Murray Street. The shop was wisely located, as these advertisements also tell you, opposite City Hall and 1 block south of the successful dry goods emporium of A.T. Stewart. And these ads, just before we go on to this portrait, these ads are among the first that I've been able to find announcing the opening of Tiffany & Young. This is a very rare portrait, and we're very lucky to have this in our collection, of Charles Louis Tiffany in 1840, 3 years after opening Tiffany & Young in New York. Like Charles Tiffany, many young men seeking their fortunes relocated to New York from either New England or Western New York State during the early 19th century. Opening a store in New York in 1837 was certainly filled with many risks, as the city was in the midst of a financial depression and was still recovering from the wide devastation caused by the fire of 1830, the Great Fire of 1835. Tiffany & Young's merchandise mix included stationery such as calling cards, writing implements, desk accessories, perfumes, and soaps. And as you can see, I think in this very distinguished looking portrait of a young merchant, the business was an immediate success. Part of that success, though, I believe, was attributed to, can be attributed to Tiffany's social connections, which were essential elements in starting a business, particularly a mercantile business in the early 19th century. Not inconsequentially, Charles Tiffany married a year after this portrait was completed, and his wife, Harriet Young, was his childhood sweetheart, but also the sister of his partner, John Young. John and Harriet Young also certainly brought important connections, both business and social connections, to these partnerships. They were, in fact, the children of a Connecticut judge named Ebenezer Young, who served as a United States congressman, was at one point president of the Connecticut State Senate, and was a group owner in one of southeastern Connecticut's most successful textile mills from the period. Tiffany and Young gained a third partner in 1841, a man named Jabez Ellis, excuse me. And Jabez Ellis brought needed capital to the firm. Thereafter, John Young began to take yearly trips abroad to purchase European glassware and porcelain, cutlery, and different kinds of clocks and jewelry for the New York store. Beginning in 1845, the firm published the fruits of these overseas buying trips in what at that point they called a catalog of useful and fancy articles. This 1845 catalog was a very tiny 32-page booklet with an eye-catching green paper cover, and this was the precursor and the beginning of what would later become Tiffany's yearly blue books. Tiffany and Young claimed that their goods were of the finest quality that they could find, finer than many sold in New York. And they promised the newest and most select styles and the lowest prices. By 1847, they were selling jewelry as well as silverware, including pieces made in New York by some of the local jewelers and silversmiths. 1 year later, in 1848, while John Young was in Europe on one of these buying trips, he witnessed the displacement of the aristocracy in France and Germany as a result of the revolutionary activities in both of those countries. As a result, Young purchased hundreds of precious stones, including jewels from the holdings of King Louis Philippe I of France. Procurement of these emeralds, diamonds, rubies, pearls, and other gems forever altered the Tiffany business. And thereafter, Tiffany, Young, and Ellis became a favorite of wealthy Americans interested in acquiring jewelry once owned by European royalty or aristocracy. It was also at that point when newspapers started to refer to Charles Tiffany as the quote-unquote king of diamonds, and it was a moniker that he carried through the rest of his life. Building on the success and purchase of these gems and the successful sale of many of them, Tiffany, Young, and Ellis began to sell began to manufacture, their own gold and gemstone jewelry, which became one of the primary focuses of the retailer. If we could go to the next slide, please. Tiffany, Young, and Ellis also offered their patrons a wide assortment of stylish tableware. This water pitcher is an example of one of the firm's Asian-inspired pieces of silver made around 1850. This piece is made purely from hand techniques, and it's very elaborately chased, which is a methodology of pushing the silver rather than engraving and etching into the material to create this beautiful panoramic Asian-inspired backdrop. This kind of work was really became less available as time went on after the 1850s, and would really become the purview of only the finest custom and handmade silver in the United States. The next slide, please. The silver sold by Tiffany, Young, and Ellis was manufactured by several of New York top silversmiths. As indicated by the initials that you see on the hallmark next to this cup and saucer, this piece of silver, these two pieces, were made for Tiffany, Young, and Ellis by a silversmith named John C. Moore. John C. Moore was active in New York probably by about 1827, but he became very well known to the American and actually the international public by about 1841. Moore began to produce silver on a regular basis for Tiffany, Young, and Ellis by about 1847, which is again when the retailer started to sell goods, silver goods, into their merchandise mix. Moore was involved with the Tiffany firm, but also was involved with firms like Ball, Tompkins and Black and their successor firm, Ball, Black and Company. Ball Black was also another very important luxury retailer in New York during the mid-19th century. John C. Moore's work gained international recognition in 1851 at the Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of All Nations in London, also known as the Crystal Palace Exhibition. And this was extremely unusual for an American silversmith at the time. Moore had manufactured a gold coffee and tea service that was made for an American shipping magnate named Edward Collins for the firm of Ball, Black and Company. And this elegant gold tea service was shown at the exhibition in London to great acclaim. The Collins service was made of 21.5 carats of California gold that had been mined only 3 months prior to the manufacture of the service. And it was a dazzling sight and hailed enthusiastically in published reports and in some of the exhibition guides. It was due to this renown of the service, and again, the service was widely covered in both American and international newspapers and pictured in very large drawings. But it was due to this popularity and renown that the Collins service was then again shown in 1853 at the New York Crystal Palace Exhibition of Industry of All Nations, along with other works by Ball, Black and Company. But it was also a way in which John C. Moore continued to gain renown. One of the things that Moore did early on was that he became a subcontractor for many of the luxury firms in New York. And perhaps with longevity of his own firm in mind, Moore actually left his association with Ball, Black and Company after the London exhibition and entered into a precedent-setting exclusive partnership agreement with Tiffany, Young and Ellis in 1851. Concurrent with that agreement, John C. Moore's son, Edward, became a partner in the silver-making firm. John C. Moore relinquished much of the firm to his son by about 1854, and from this time, you often see the name of the firm referred to as E.C. Moore and Company. Nevertheless, as we've learned from some of the account books that survived from the Moore firm, John C. Moore remained active in the firm through the 1860s. The next slide, please. New York's premier silversmiths continued to make silver for Tiffany, Young and Ellis and Tiffany Company during the 1850s and 60s. Among these silversmiths were several New York firms, including the firm that made this piece, Grosjean and Woodward. And they were active in New York from about 1854 to 1865. The identity of the silver makers is prominently displayed in the hallmark that I'm showing you next to the presentation bowl. And the hallmark is also a very important element of Tiffany silver. But before I talk to you about that, I just want to let you know this presentation bowl was given to a man named James P. Fagan, who was a superintendent of the State Immigrant Refuge and Hospital on Ward's Island as a testimonial of respect by his colleagues in 1864. So Tiffany hallmarks are very, very important, and they offer they're vital documentation for American silver. And this hallmark in particular gives some wonderful information about the actual silversmiths. As we've mentioned already, the G&W refer to Grosjean and Woodward, who actually made the bowl for the retailer. It also, the number underneath Tiffany and Company is a pattern number, so it's a way to trace the pattern. But underneath the initials, you also see an indication of what the silver was actually made of. So here you see a stamp that refers to English sterling, often referred to as 925 or 925-1000, which is the way it's represented here. This mark guarantees that the bowl is made from the sterling, the English sterling alloy, which is an alloy of 92.5% pure silver and 7.5% copper, gold, and other metals. 3 American silver manufacturers introduced the use of the sterling alloy as the standard content for their silver during the 1850s and 60s. Tiffany and Company was probably the first by about 1857, followed by Ball Black and Company in 1860, and then the Rhode Island Gorham manufacturing firm in 1868. While the use of this alloy in all probability was spurred by the 1859 discovery of native supplies of silver ore in Colorado and Nevada, adoption of the sterling standard was an indication of how far the American silver trade had progressed. Prior to the use of the sterling standard, most American silver was made primarily from melted silver hollowware, old silver hollowware, or from silver coins. With the sterling alloy, American silver manufacturers put themselves in a very firm position to compete internationally with English and European makers. We could go to the next slide. John Young and Jabez Ellis retired from the Tiffany firm in 1853. And thereafter, the firm became known as Tiffany and Company, as it is today. This advertisement, probably from about 1855, still refers to the firm's former name. And as you see underneath the building and underneath the name Tiffany and Company, it says late Tiffany, Young, and Ellis. Tiffany and Company astutely followed New York City's northward development. In 1854, the firm relocated to a new building, the building shown in this advertisement, which was an elegant retail palace located at Broadway and Prince Street. By 1850, Broadway between Canal and Houston Streets was the site of a number of high-end retailers who became identified brands. And these stores in turn solidified Broadway's reputation as New York City's most active and elegant commercial district during the mid-19th century. Tiffany and Company relocated several more times. Between 1870 and 1940. In 1870, they moved to Union Square near 15th Street. And at that point, Union Square and the neighborhood around it was a very fashionable residential district. And the Tiffany move really was the beginning of the move of several other firms. And it was that area that was known as the Ladies' Mile Shopping District. Tiffany then moved again somewhere probably in late 1905 or early 1906 to a new building that they built at Fifth Avenue near 35th Street. And then in 1940, they moved to their present location, located at 57th Street and Fifth Avenue. The next slide, please. These pages are from a petty cash book from John C. and Edward C. Moore's Silver Shop. The book itself dates from the years 1857 through 1860. This book is not in the Historical Society collection. This book is now held by the Tiffany & Company Archive, which is located in New Jersey. And, but these account books are really incredible records of the building up of the, what became Tiffany & Company's Silver Shop. By the time of Moore's exclusive agreement with Tiffany, Young, and Ellis, Moore's Silver Shop was becoming a mechanized operation that employed a number of very specially trained craftsmen. And he was also using a variety of hand and mechanical techniques to create silver hollowware. And by 1851, in fact, John C. Moore's shop was one of the few silver shops in New York who had started to integrate steam engine power to power its machinery. But these pages show a couple of other things that are very interesting. Number one, if you look on the page that is dated April 1858, one of the things that we see here is are references to two silversmiths who were actually very well-known flatware makers in New York City, John Polhemus and Henry Hebard. Both of those makers worked with John Seymour and probably made flatware and supplied that to the Moore firm. And then on the other page, if you look all the way toward the bottom, you see a reference to J.M. Moffett Rolling Mill. So mostly some of the listings that you're seeing on this page indicate the purchase of items such as tools or punches or locks, different kinds of elements that would have been used in the production of silver. But importantly, also rolled sheet silver made by James Moffett, who was the owner of a rolling mill located in Bloomfield, New Jersey, right outside of Newark. There was a lot of metal manufacture that went on in the Newark area, and at different points of time, Newark was actually known as the Birmingham of America. We can go to the next slide, please. This is a plate from Diderot's Encyclopedia, published probably around 1763. And I'm showing this plate to you just to give you a sense of what silver workshops would have looked like in the 18th century, really up until the early 19th century. So the shop, as you see in this image, was traditionally staffed by a small number of craftsmen and probably an apprentice who's seen toward the front pouring some molten silver into an ingot mold. And it would have been outfitted with some workbenches and areas to hammer and finish and engrave silver. This mode of working was really many, many generations old, and silver manufacture really didn't change until the mid and late 18th century. Among some of the changes that happened early on, and we discussed this actually in the Beyond Midnight exhibition, was the introduction of tabletop rolling mills, which made flattened sheet silver, which hastened the process of making silver hollowware. And so these small rolling mills were actually developed in England in the mid 18th century. And then after the Revolutionary War, became more available in the United States. And in fact, Paul Revere was one of the first American silversmiths to be recorded as purchasing this type of rolling mill from England. If we could go to the next slide, please. It was Edward Seymour, though, who oversaw the transition of his family's independent silver workshop to become Tiffany Company's silver department. And as the retailer's premier silver manufacturer, the Moore shop relocated to a multi-story building on Prince Street, adjacent to and in back of the new Tiffany & Company showplace at 550 Broadway in 1864. Then, from that time on, the Moore shop was known as the Prince Street Works. Then in 1868, Charles L. Tiffany purchased the Prince Street Works for $55,000, and it was absorbed into the larger organization of the retailer. Simultaneously, Edward Seymour became the design director of Tiffany & Company's silver division. Hollowware was the primary focus of the Prince Street Works, and at the point that it became a physical part of Tiffany & Company. And at that point in time, the Prince Street Works was actually becoming a very large operation. It employed about 200 workers, which is quite a lot for 1868, and reportedly used over 150 ounces of silver to manufacture its celebrated hollowware. by that year too, the Prince Street Works was really being touted as an exemplary factory, an early form of a factory with the latest mechanized technology. And they were really instrumental in creating a faster pace with the way that silver was manufactured. Moore possessed an innate understanding of mercantilism and management, as well as being a very highly trained silversmith and a prolific and innovative designer. Under his stewardship, Tiffany Company received many different medals and commendations for their silver, including at the 1867 Paris Exposition, the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition, and the 1878 and 1889 Paris Expositions. This tureen is typical of Tiffany silver, probably designed by Moore during the early 1860s. It is relatively minimally decorated with what I would characterize as neoclassical ornament. You see in the center, egg and dart and beaded borders. The handles are inspired by vines, and they have sculpted and cast ram's head terminals. And at the top is this wonderful cast helmet finial. This tureen was presented to a man named William Henry Anthon, who was a prominent New York lawyer who was appointed Judge Advocate General in 1863 in recognition of his preparations for the city's Civil War draft. The next slide, please. Journalists from Scientific American visited the Prince Street Works in 1877. The four-story factory that they described in great detail is partially illustrated on the cover of Scientific American from May of 1877. So what you're seeing on the cover are some of the sites and the workspaces that the reporters described. So among those spaces, they described a melting room, and you see that at the top left, where the firm's silver alloy was prepared. They also described a rolling room, and you see that underneath the melting room, where rolled sheet silver for hollowware was created. They also described a stamping room, and you see that at the top right, as well as a spinning room where hollowware was turned on steam-powered lathes. And I'm showing you an example of a steam-powered lathe in the detail at the right. Moore also established in that building a design studio where he trained apprentices, as well as a very extensive art reference library. In the detail at the right, you're seeing a steam-powered spinning lathe. These types of lathes allowed silversmiths to manufacture rounded hollowware components. And you see a piece of hollowware in the center of the cover page toward the bottom. These components would have formerly taken days to manufacture, and with the steam-powered lathe, you could conceivably make those parts in an hour's time. So steam-driven rolling mills, stamping mills, and spinning lathes really saved hours and days of work and replaced very laborious hand processes. We could go to the next slide, please. Americans became fascinated by Japanese art, culture, and design, particularly after the extensive newspaper coverage that accompanied Commodore Matthew Perry's 1853 mission to Japan. The vogue for things Japanese inspired many American artists, designers, and manufacturers, including Edward C. Moore. Under Moore, Tiffany Company led the way in creating silver, such as the tea caddy and the two teapots that I'm showing you here, that interpreted either Japanese forms or metalworking techniques into an American aesthetic. If we look at the tea caddy first, so the piece all the way on the left, the treatment visible on the exterior of this tea caddy is known as makome gane. Makome gane is a Japanese technique that creates the appearance of wood grain with metal. Makome gane is actually made from soldered sheets of layered copper, gold, silver, and bronze, hammered and then rolled together until it brings out this appearance of grained wood. Tiffany plant records suggest that this tea caddy was a unique piece, and although the pattern drawings that survive at the Tiffany archive indicates that tops, different kinds of tops could be ordered. So you could order a top in silver, jade, ivory, or wood. And in this case, we believe that the finial in this caddy is made of ivory. Moore and the Tiffany Silver Factory made Japanese style silver from approximately 1871 until 1889. And among his Japanese inspired designs is the pattern that you see on the small teapot at the center, the Gordon Vine pattern, which is enhanced with mixed metals and then topped with a jade finial. And then the standing daisy work pattern teapot is another example of one of Moore's Japanese-inspired hollowware patterns. Moore, again, was fascinated by Japanese design, and by the time of his death had amassed a personal collection of Near and Far Eastern ceramics, lacquerware, arms, and metalwork. And this collection had a major impact on the silver firm. When Moore died, he bequeathed that collection to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where it is now. And happily, I want to add that our colleagues at the Metropolitan Museum are in the midst of working on a major exhibition and catalog about Moore's collection and his designs and work with Tiffany and Company. The extent of Moore's interest in Japanese design was really pretty unquenchable. And in addition to acquiring Japanese carvings and enamels and metalwork, he also commissioned English designer Christopher Dresser to travel to Japan on behalf of Tiffany and Company in 1876, where he also purchased many different types of Japanese pieces for Moore's collection. We can go to the next slide, please. Moore's stewardship of the Prince Street works, along with his prolific and acclaimed designs, were instrumental in Tiffany and Company's extensive lines of domestic and presentation silver, including pieces designed in his East Indian, arabesque, and Mooresque patterns and motifs. And much of this silver in these motifs are some of his most elaborate pieces. This ice cream dish that I'm showing you here, which is in the New York Historical Society collection, was actually one of two that were part of an extravagant 1,250-piece dinner and dessert service made by Tiffany and Company for a man named John W. and his wife, Marie Louise Mackey. In 1853, John Mackey became known as the Silver King after he was instrumental in discovering the Comstock Lode Mine, a large silver deposit in Virginia City, Nevada. Mackey had the service made from half of a ton of silver extracted from the mine. And it was the largest and most ornate dinner service made during the Gilded Age. Reportedly, it took 200 craftsmen approximately 2 years to create this silver service. Edward C. Moore was instrumental in conceptualizing the overall service, described by the firm as being in an Indian pattern. The Indian pattern was very much inspired by Persian and Mughal Indian motifs, and again was a reflection of Moore's interest in Near Eastern and Asian art. The design of the service is hollowware, and again, this ice cream dish is one of those pieces, is attributed to a man named Charles T. Grosjean, based on its resemblance to other works that he created for Tiffany and Company, including the popular chrysanthemum pattern, which was his design. Grosjean was one of several accomplished silversmiths and designers who worked for the Prince Street Works and Tiffany and Company beginning in the 1860s. We can go to the next slide, please. Moore's fascination with Near Eastern design included Persian and Ottoman-inspired works that incorporated mixed metals, enamel, and hard stones. Moore's award-winning Saracenic designs, and I'm showing you an example of that here, as the style was known, is evident in this little tea caddy, which is small, but really packs a big impact as almost its own gem of a composition. And it's ornamented inside and out. The exterior of the tea caddy is covered with colorful floral and geometric enameled motifs that are similar to others that were integrated into many of Moore's Saracenic designs. And then this rich design scheme is continued, and as you can see in the slide, underneath the lid and on top of the interior knob and body of the cover. Both are etched in a Persian-style floral pattern. And according to Tiffany & Company records, the caddy was one of two that were made, only two, and they were probably enameled by a man named John T. Curran. Curran became a renowned enameler, and he was one of many young craftsmen who trained under Moore at the Prince Street Works. If you could go to the next slide, please. New York Historical Society holds numerous examples of small silver objects, such as small silver Tiffany objects, I should say, such as cigarette and match cases, perfume bottles, parasol handles, many tea infusers, keys, card cases, commemorative medals, and ceremonial trowels, not to mention many pieces of flatware. Among the personal accessories designed specifically for women by the firm is this chatelaine purse that I'm showing you on the left, which once belonged to Cornelia Augusta Beekman. Because of silver's high cost and value, men traditionally purchased silver goods, whether for their homes or as gifts. And up until the 1870s, silver goods were largely gendered, meaning that they were made and intended for men, or made for and intended for men. In fact, much of the presentation silver that the New York Historical Society holds was purchased by men, for men, and given often at male-dominated public presentations. Women's accessories and household goods, such as this chatelaine purse and the bonbon server shown next to it, became more common after the 1870s, when silver became cheaper and thus easier to manufacture in a variety of different forms. After the 1870s, for example, silver ladles, large silver punch ladles, became fashionable wedding gifts, primarily presented to women. The bonbon server that I'm showing you is one of two that we have in the collection. The larger versions, such as this example, were often used to pass candy or chocolate-covered ice creams. And sometimes these servers are referred to as bonbonnières. If we can go to the next slide, please. This is an enormous loving cup, a trophy essentially, presented to New York City Mayor William Gaynor in 1911. William Gaynor served as the mayor of New York City from 1909 to 1913. In August of 1910, a discharged city employee attempted to assassinate him on the deck of an ocean liner as he was about to embark for Europe. The bullet entered near his throat rather, and was never extracted. During his recovery, the normally cantankerous mayor was said to show extreme patience and fortitude. This very large cup was presented to Gaynor by a committee of aldermen on the first anniversary of the assassination attempt. It measures 15 inches in height and 14 inches in width and weighs over 5,000 grams, which translates into 188 troy ounces, which is a measurement used to weigh silver. And it was just an absolutely grand display for a politician with a reputation for having an enormous personality. I find also the ornamentation on the belly of the cup to be very interesting. And in part, I wonder if it may have been inspired by early Dutch New York silver, some of which we have in our collection, especially the flower arrangements that you see, because they're very similar to the types of flowers that appear on colonial brandywine bowls. If we could go to the next slide. One of the Historical Society's more unusual pieces of silver is this ceremonial subway controller handle, New York City Mayor George B. McClellan used this sterling silver subway controller to drive the city's first subway train on its maiden voyage on October 27, 1904. August Belmont, the president of the Interborough Rapid Transit Railroad, presented this hefty handle with a beautifully carved and turned ebony knob during the subway system's inaugural festivities that day at City Hall. McClellan used the handle to power the train and was so intoxicated by the speed of the train that he raced through the scheduled stop at 42nd Street and continued to drive the train uptown, only yielding the controls to the company's conductor at 103rd Street. And the photograph that I'm showing you next to it shows McClellan at the controls. And that photograph also is in the collection of the New York Historical Society. The next slide, please. Sorry about that. Let's see. This sterling silver hip flask belonged to George Albert Zabriskie, a food industry executive and officer of the United States Food Administration and Sugar Equalization Board from 1939 to 1947. New York Historical, he was also New York Historical Society's 22nd president. Zabriskie was involved in the anti-prohibition movement and served as an officer of the Moderation League, which was one of several quote-unquote wet advocacy groups. This hip flask may have been a personal statement for him. Hip flasks were particularly criticized by prohibition advocates and were perceived during Prohibition as symbols of public intoxication and promiscuity. In New York, the ban on hip flasks became a veritable war. And as the New York Times announced in one article in 1922, and this is quote unquote from a headline, Uncle Sam starts war on hip flasks. Broadway resorts warned by squad that diners must not bring liquor in. Next slide, please. This is a coffee service that is another example of Tiffany & Company's Persian-inspired Saracenic designs developed by Edward Seymour beginning in the 1870s. Although this coffee set was actually produced between 1912 and 1931, more than 20 years after Moore's death, it closely adheres to Saracenic designs more created decades earlier. And I'm showing you one of those designs in the blueprint next to it. We could go to the next slide, please. This is a cigar box that was presented to Al Smith probably in 1929 or early 1930. This cigar box was inspired by precious medieval caskets and was presented to the four-time New York State governor and 1928 Democratic Party presidential candidate after he lost the 1928 election. Smith was a well-known cigar aficionado who reputedly smoked between 12 and 14 cigars a day. In fact, many of Smith's surviving letters from his time as New York State governor, held at the New York State Library, are signed by him with the closing, "I'm smoking to your good health." Surviving design drawings in the Tiffany & Company archive refer to the cigar box's decorative patterning as an example of the firm's arabesque style. The Moorish style ornament recalls decorative motifs from the Alhambra in Granada, Spain. This cigar box was hand etched and hand engraved and took at least 4 artisans over 105 hours to complete and consists of nearly 12 pounds of silver. If we could go to the next slide, thank you. And as you see on the inside of the cigar box is a dedication affixed to the underside of the cover. And the dedication notes that the presentation to Smith happened in the wake of the 1928 presidential election, and the cigar box itself was presented by newspaper publisher Paul Block. Block also ran the same dedication to Smith in the New York Times and the Brooklyn Standard Union around the same time. If we could go to the next slide. Tiffany Company did not manufacture flatware until 1869. These coffee spoons in Tiffany Company's Persian pattern were designed also by Edward C. Moore, and they are, again, in the mode of his other Saracenic works. This pattern was referred to, again, as the Persian pattern. If we could go to the next slide, please. Edward C. Moore's first flatware design for the firm was created in 1969, and the pattern was the first to be created exclusively for Tiffany & Company. And it seems logical to me that after the Prince Street Works was purchased by Charles Lewis Tiffany, that they would in fact start making flatware as well. These are two of the earliest patents for Tiffany & Company flatware, and these patents, both from 1870, later became known as both the Italian pattern, so that's the patent that you're seeing on the left, and then on the right, the Ivy pattern. During the 1870s and 80s, many more patterns were designed and patented by Tiffany & Company, and that extended well into the early 20th century. If we could go to the next slide, please. New York Historical Society has been the lucky recipient of several outstanding gifts of Tiffany silver since the publication of our silver catalog, Stories in Sterling, in 2011. One of these additions includes this outstanding presentation bowl given to architect Cass Gilbert by five and dime merchant Frank W. Woolworth. Upon completion of the Woolworth building, 900 men gathered on the 27th floor on April 24th, 1913, to take part in a lavish dinner celebrating the skyscraper's opening and honoring its architect, Cass Gilbert. The New York Times described the event as the highest skyscraper dinner ever held in the world. At the time, Tiffany & Company, dubbed as the Cathedral of Commerce, had the distinction of being the tallest building in the world, a distinction it held until 1930. F.W. Woolworth presented this monumental punch bowl to Cass Gilbert as a small token of his regard during the dinner. The bowl is just absolutely monumental. It is almost 10 inches high, but 17 inches in diameter. Around the rim of it, you see that it incorporates neo-Gothic motifs surrounding the rim that are very much inspired by the architectural ornament that Gilbert incorporated into the actual building. And then it is inscribed in gold lettering. And then inside the bowl, which I'm showing you, is a chase scene showing the Woolworth building as viewed from City Hall Park. If we could go to the next slide, please. Another new addition to New York Historical Society's silver collection, Tiffany silver, is this exceptional and very extravagant oversized tankard made of ivory, sterling silver, lapis lazuli, and with a glass interior. The oversized and extravagant tankard was given to a former Tammany Hall chief named Richard Croker by New York City financier Andrew Friedman in 1905. Croker was actually an Irish immigrant and became involved in New York City politics at a young age. By the age of 28, he was elected to New York City's Board of Aldermen. During his political career, he held several key positions, including New York City coroner and fire commissioner. After assuming the leadership of Tammany Hall in 1886, he assembled a close group of his advisors who basically assured his extensive influence over the city's appointments, elections, and finances. One of those advisors was Andrew Friedman. Croker presided as the boss of Tammany Hall for 16 years, but corruption charges under his leadership were rampant. After the electoral defeat of several Tammany-backed candidates in 1900 and 1901, he retreated to an estate in his native Ireland and retired from Tammany Hall. During this period, ivory and motifs such as the leopard or lion shown on the bottom were associated with the sport of hunting, and consequently gifts like this tankard were really felt to be ideal presentations for powerful men. If we could go to the next slide, please. This is a partial child's dining service, and it's one example of many types of children's silver and tableware and flatware created and sold by Tiffany & Company beginning in the 1850s and really continuing to the present day. The plate and saucer are decorated in the firm's King Cole pattern, inspired by nursery rhymes and other children's stories. And it was designed around 1905, probably by Albert Angel Southwick. Southwick was an American-born designer and metalsmith known for his Art Nouveau style. He trained initially at the Rhode Island School of Design and then went on to study in Berlin and Vienna and Paris. Not surprisingly, his residence in Paris from 1898 to 1900 occurred during the height of the French Art Nouveau movement. Southwick worked for Tiffany & Company from about 1903 to 1919, and during that time he served as the head designer of the firm's renowned silver department. The next slide, please. This is another very rare piece that we have in our collection that is not a piece of silver. What I'm showing you here is an apprentice certificate that was awarded to a man named Adalbert Nordbrock. Nordbrock was a German immigrant who arrived in the United States in 1887. Within a year after his arrival, he began a coveted 5-year apprenticeship at the Prince Street Works. As shown in this rare certificate, and no other certificate like this is known to survive, including at the Tiffany Archive. He completed his training in 1893. And with the gift of this certificate, his family also donated several photographs of him at work in various silver shops during the course of his career. Tiffany's Prince Street Works remained downtown, even as the retail arm of the company moved uptown. And by 1893, it occupied an entire city block and employed close to 500 workers. Comprehensive expansion of the firm's silver production began, however, in 1892, when Tiffany & Company purchased 7 acres outside of Newark, New Jersey, for the construction of the state-of-the-art manufactory. And that manufactory was regarded as one of the most efficiently equipped silverware factories in the world. It was a 45,000 foot complex, square foot complex, and featured cutting edge buildings and machinery and energy sources, and powered by electricity, apparently one of the first factories to be entirely powered by electricity. It also included 3 water systems that supply boilers, steam engines, drinking water, and fire protection, and included workshops for every function in the process of silver manufacturing, from rolling silver to polishing and finishing and repairing goods. If we could go to the last slide, please. New York Historical Society continues to collect Tiffany silver, particularly pieces that have descended through and played a part in New York family life. This tea and coffee service shows an early guise of Edward Seymour's Saracenic designs, probably created around or before 1870, again, based on Ottoman and Persian metalwork. This coffee and tea service was actually purchased secondhand by a Jewish immigrant who became a successful labor consultant to the garment district. The original owner and his family were eager to acquire fine goods that they could use when celebrating the Jewish Sabbath and other holidays. And because they could not afford new silver at the time, they very, very carefully purchased a number of pieces of Tiffany silver, many of which are in various types of Saracenic designs. It is not certain if they were aware of the origin and the relationships to these Saracenic design pieces, but it's just interesting to note that many of the pieces that were purchased have hallmarks that date them to the design of Edward Seymour during the period that he was creating Saracenic works. And with that design are these two casters that are also in more Saracenic mode. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to all of you and to your questions. Okay. So let's see. Let's see, a couple of questions. One question that I'm seeing, how did the various American wars or economic depressions affect Tiffany & Company's ability to craft or sell silver pieces? You know, it varied from war to war. During the Civil War, for example, Tiffany & Company definitely had a sort of a decline in the amount of silver they were producing. But one of the things that they were very cleverly did during the Civil War was they became a storage repository, particularly for Southern families who needed places to store their silver. So I would say that the company was very astute in finding ways to weather the various world wars and continued to produce silver throughout. Now let's see if we have, okay, let's see. Another question, what do we know about the backgrounds of the men who worked as craftsmen as opposed to the designers? That's a very interesting question. It appears that most of the craftsmen who were working for Tiffany & Company through about the 1860s were largely of American origin. But beginning in the 1850s, there start to be a number of craftsmen who were employed by Tiffany & Company who were German and in some cases English. I don't know very much about the origin of the other workers beyond some of the main silversmiths, but I think that that's a very important question and an area that really warrants additional study. The other thing I will say is that the silver industry was largely a male-dominated industry. Women were employed to some degree, particularly after about 1860, but they often did tasks like polishing or anything that required kind of work with sort of small scale work with their hands because the women were considered to be more agile. Okay, some other questions. Let's see. What do we look for when adding pieces to the collection? That's also a great question. We look for a number of different things. One of the things we look for is what sorts of social historical associations those pieces might have. So in the case of the silver that I showed in the last slide, the newest pieces coming into the collection, those pieces are associated with a Jewish immigrant family, and we don't have any other Tiffany silver in the collection that came through a Jewish family. And in this case in particular, we also have documentation about the ways in which the family used the silver to celebrate the Sabbath or Jewish holidays. In some cases, we look for unusual designs or designs that we don't have in our collection. And you know, it really varies. It depends on the piece and depends on the stories that we might be able to tell with whatever piece it is that we're considering. Let's see. It looks like that's our last question. So I thank you all for your time, and I look forward to seeing you back at the New York Historical Society and being able to show you the collection, the silver collection in person. And I want to close by saying that we look forward to seeing you back here next week for our program, Betty Saar, Extreme Times, Call for Extreme Heroines with Wendy Ikemoto, who is our Curator of American Art. So thank you again for your time, and I wish you all a very good evening.